This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. On Capitol Hill, Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Chris Coons have introduced a bipartisan bill aimed to protect undocumented immigrants who came to the United States as children. The future of the nearly 800,000 Dreamers has been at the center of a major political battle in Washington. But on Monday, President Trump took to Twitter to criticize the bipartisan bill soon after it was introduced. Trump wrote, quote, "Any deal on DACA that does not include strong border security and the desperately needed wall is a total waste of time. March 5th is rapidly approaching, and the Dems seem not to care about DACA. Make a deal," unquote. This comes as immigrant rights activists are preparing to hold a protest in Washington Wednesday to push for a clean DREAM Act to be passed before Thursday, when the government faces another possible shutdown.
Well, as the battle over the Dreamers heats up in Washington, D.C., we look at a stunning new piece in the New Yorker magazine, headlined, "When Deportation is a Death Sentence." It looks at how an unknown number of men and women have been killed in their home countries after being deported or turned away by the United States. The article looks in part at a Mexican-born woman named Laura. Despite living her whole adult life in Texas, she was deported to Mexico after a traffic stop. She warned a U.S. Border Patrol agent, "When I'm found dead, it will be on your conscience." Within a week of her deportation, she was murdered by her ex-husband. We're joined now by the award-winning journalist and New Yorker staff writer Sarah Stillman, also director of the Global Migration Project at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me here.
This is such a significant piece. It seems, though, that the government should be collecting this data, not you and a group of students at the Columbia Journalism School, about what happens to immigrants who are deported. But start off where you started in the piece, with Laura's story.
Right. So I wrote about this young woman, Laura, who had been living in the U.S., as you mentioned, most of her adult life. She's driving home from work one night, and she's pulled over by a traffic cop. And at the time, it was relatively unroutine for a cop to actually ask about her immigration status, but that's what he did. And he chose to turn her over to Border Patrol.
In the middle of the night.
Exactly. This was in the middle of the night, and so no lawyers' offices are open at that hour. She's driven with some friends while crying and pleading and saying, "Look, I have this really violent husband back in Mexico. He's threatened to kill me if I'm sent back. Please just give me some time to show you my protective order, to show you why I should stay here." And instead, she was quickly turned over to Border Patrol, quickly then, while continuing to cry and plead, taken to the border and sent right back across the bridge after being coerced into signing some voluntary paperwork.
And she spent most of her life here in the U.S.? Can you talk about her life here?
Exactly. So she had U.S. citizen children, and she'd grown up in Mexico, but in her adulthood had been living in Texas in a community with many other people who were undocumented and who at the time didn't tend to worry that traffic stops would lead to their deportation to harm. But I think that's becoming more and more typical in recent months. But this was under the Obama administration that this occurred.
Now, clearly, the Mexican government doesn't do any tracking of the people that are repatriated from the United States. Is there any attempt, even within Mexico, to do a more comprehensive look about what's happening to the folks deported?
Yeah, I think we really see it piecemeal. We've seen some human rights workers and some scholars who try to document this. It's extraordinarily hard because, as you can imagine, when people are sent back, it's quite hard to track what becomes of them, partly because families are so afraid when something does happen, that the fear of retaliation often means that we don't hear about the awful things that happen to people post-deportation.
As you point out, the Trump administration has formed a new office called Voice. Explain what that is.
So initially, when Trump came into office, he expounded quite a bit on what he perceives as immigrant criminality. And one of the things he said he would do is create a special office for the victims of crimes committed by immigrants. He did not square that with the data that tells us that immigrants actually do not commit more crime than U.S.-born individuals. And in fact, the opposite has been proven true in most scholarship on this issue. So this database was essentially going to also log all the different immigrant crimes that had been committed. And so So part of what I thought about with my Columbia team at the journalism school was, in some respects, we were building a shadow database to that. We were building a database that showed the many, many people, both under Obama and under Trump, who had been deported and then either killed or sexually assaulted or subject to other kinds of harm.
Well, as you note in your article, the United States obviously has a long history of providing sanctuary for those seeking to avoid danger or killing in their home countries. What are Customs Border Patrol agents supposed to do if a person claims that they fear possible persecution, and what are they actually doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think a lot of people don't realize that in both international law and domestic law, a fundamental U.S. value has been that we have guaranteed post-World War II that we will never again make the mistake of deporting people to their deaths when they come to us seeking sanctuary. That was created out of World War II in part because we sent many people back amidst the Holocaust who had fled Nazi Germany. And so what we're seeing at the border today, and what many human rights groups have been documenting, is that Border Patrol's job is essentially, when someone arrives at the border, they're supposed to ask them a set of questions, which includes, do you fear for your life if you are sent back? And if the person says, yes, I do, it is not their job to adjudicate that or to try to figure out whether they think it's credible. Their job is simply to pass someone along to a trained asylum officer. We have people who are very well trained in the next stage of vetting, and people often get to go before an immigration judge. What we're finding is that in upwards of 50% of cases, often Border Patrol isn't even asking that initial required question. And sometimes I spoke to many women who said that they had answered in the affirmative, had said very clearly they did fear for their lives, and nonetheless the Border Patrol paperwork was marked that they did not.
So in the case of Laura, following on this questioning at the border, when she's handed over to Border Patrol and she says to the agent, when I am dead, it will be on your conscience, what was it his obligation to do?
Well, this is currently being disputed in the courts because there's been a lawsuit on her behalf after she was, in fact, killed when sent back. But ideally, someone in her situation would get to go before an immigration judge. And, that historically, that was the case, that for a long time, people in the United States, when they did articulate these fears, if they articulated them immediately at the border, they would go to an asylum officer, and then they would get to go before an immigration judge. Increasingly, we're seeing that the vast majority of deportations are what's known as summary deportations, so people who are very quickly turned around directly at the border and never given a chance to see a judge. Or in the case of someone like Laura, who had lived in the country for a very long time, in that case, you would certainly be entitled to a judge.
So what have you and your students found?
There's been quite a few patterns that we've seen in this database. One of them is just how often people like Laura get rounded up in pretty minor offenses. So people who had traffic violations, people who had minor workplace disputes that actually led to very high stakes repercussions, so being deported and then killed. We've also seen a real pattern of women who had fled gender-based violence, who in fact had explicit documentation of the men who had harmed them in the past, and then they came here seeking to escape from that, and instead were sent back to the very same men who had harmed them. And of course, we're seeing an uptick under Trump in the number of people who are rounded up in the interior of the country. So previously, we'd focused mostly on people who were turned back at the border. But increasingly, we're seeing people like Laura who had very deep roots here, who had lived here for a long time, who had U.S. citizen children who were sent back.
I mean, Laura, the cop who arrested Laura, ended up going to jail himself. Is that right? He said she was wavering on the road or
exactly.
something?
He said she'd been driving between two lanes. And who knows? I mean, that's certainly possible, but it didn't tend to be the case, as I mentioned earlier, that people in that circumstance would be deported, whereas now we're seeing legislation in Texas known as SB 4 that may soon be replicated elsewhere in the country that says law enforcement, in fact, has to ask these questions. And in fact, law enforcement can be prosecuted criminally if they do not turn people over for immigration enforcement purposes. So that's a huge transformation of law enforcement that many cops that I spoke to were worried about.
Well, that's what I want to ask you in her case in particular, because it's one thing, a catch and release situation right at the border, but if she was already here in the country, wasn't there a requirement, a minimal requirement for her to go through some immigration process? A lot of times people voluntarily agree to be deported to not be detained and put in an ICE jail, but was she never offered the opportunity to try to adjudicate her case?
Yeah, I think that's a critical distinction, right? We have different entitlements for people who have been here for a long time, and in her case, her signature appeared on the form that was a voluntary removal form. So that's what's currently being disputed in the courts, is that, can this be accurately described as a voluntary removal when, in fact, she was pleading and crying and protesting. Border Patrol says that she voluntarily signed and was sent back as a result of that. And her friend who was there at the scene says that, in fact, she had been desperate not to sign the paperwork. So that's the mystery at the heart of the case, and that was what a judge argued made her family not able to proceed with the case. So we'll see what happens in court.
Sarah Stillman, you mentioned SB4, known as a Show Me Your Papers bill, in Texas. Explain what that does.
Well, SB4 will do a number of things, and right now it's currently also tied up in litigation. But one of the things is, as I mentioned regarding local cops, that they are supposed to now ask people about their immigration status. It also means that there's this sort of crackdown that Trump has also called for in regard to what he and some others know as sanctuary cities, so places where they have decided not to turn people over to immigration enforcement once they're held in local jails. So one of the other patterns we saw in the database was that there were some people who came into the criminal justice system through minor offenses, like one man, Juan Coronilla Guerrero, that I wrote about. He had come to the courthouse for a minor misdemeanor case, and then ICE had actually appeared in the courthouse, apprehended him, and then he'd been deported despite claiming that he believed he would be killed if sent back to Mexico, and he was also murdered. And this was more recently, and that crackdown had been explicitly, many believe, retaliation for the fact that Travis County, Texas was a sanctuary city.
I wanted to ask you about President Trump's recent remarks at his State of the Union, where he was actually talking about the MS-13 and the increasing dangers from undocumented immigrants to the general American population, criminal gangs. Were you able to hear that? I don't know if we have the clip available of his that part of his speech, but could you?
I think we have a clip.
Oh, we do. All right. Let's hear it.
For decades, open borders have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They've allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans. Most tragically, they have caused the loss of many innocent lives.
Could you respond to the president's framing of the issue of why it's necessary to deal with immigration?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's absolutely necessary to treat MS-13 seriously, and that's part of the paradox of how Trump has reckoned with this, is that simultaneously he's saying it's okay to revoke temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of people from El Salvador and send them back to this country that is really grappling with a very real MS-13 crisis. And he's saying, oh, it's perfectly fine and safe to send them there, despite the fact that, MS-13 may actually pose a really serious threat to those people. And he's saying those people don't deserve protection here, but then he's also seems to really be intent upon sort of acting as if MS-13's crisis here has a gravity that I think empirically we could say doesn't necessarily compare to a lot of other threats that we could be focused on. But I think we should take it seriously, and I think we should also be realistic about the fact that immigrants do not pose a disproportionate threat when it comes to crime. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, the opposite has been proven to be the case.
Sarah, can you talk more about gender-based violence?
Absolutely. I mean, that was a big theme that we were seeing. And going back to the realities of needing to reckon with MS-13, I think one of the things that we heard from quite a number of young women is that they were being recruited by gang members in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, who were basically telling them, if you don't become my sexual partner, then you will be killed. And, I interviewed several women who had come. One woman who comes to mind, this woman, Elena, she had actually come here after her brother was murdered for being gay. Another brother was murdered for refusing to join the gangs. And then she herself was subject to sexual coercion by a gang member. And when she came here, she was turned away by Border Patrol. She protested, and then she went before an immigration judge. And one of the really big issues we don't talk about much is that women who are fleeing those kinds of circumstances, who even do get a chance to go before a judge, often are told that they don't qualify for asylum or other kinds of legal relief. Because our asylum system was crafted post-World War II, often the concerns that it was crafted around don't reflect the current reality of gang violence and gender-based violence.
And of course, a lot of this gang violence is the historical roots of it is not really ever discussed here in the United States. I remember back in 1992 covering the Los Angeles Angeles riots after Rodney King, and the Chicano community the longtime Mexican-American community was very upset about the rise of MS-13 back then. We're talking 25 years ago, and they saw it rooted in a spillover of the Central American Civil Wars and the U.S. intervention, that it was the original MS-13 gang members were actually former National Guardsmen from Salvador who had moved here to the United States, and there was a culture of violence that had actually spilled over from Salvador and Guatemala into the Western United States, and they saw it as a direct result of U.S. intervention. But that's never talked about these days.
Yeah, I think you can't talk about what's happening right now without talking about that exact history you just pointed to, both the history of the Central America Wars and the U.S. involvement in them, then also the history of this set of cycles around deportation, the idea that many of these gangs started on the U.S. side and in U.S. prisons and on U.S. streets, and then were deported back without a real plan about how that would be dealt with. And then we've seen this cycle before, and so we need to look at how do we address those root causes, I would argue.
Laura's mother ultimately ended up working with Jennifer Horbury, well-known for her work around Guatemala and the U.S.-backed, sadly, slaughter in Guatemala. Can you talk about that relationship?
Yes, Jennifer Horbury is a really fascinating person who's had a pretty remarkable life, and she was married to a man from Guatemala who actually had been that had led to litigation that Jennifer had been a part of after her husband disappeared. She had staged a hunger strike. This was quite some time ago in the midst of those wars. She later found that there was U.S. involvement in a cover-up about her husband's murder and torture and pretty violent circumstances. And so she was certainly a vehicle through which to tell the story of the U.S. involvement back in the 80s and how that stretched all the way up into repercussions in the present day.
Well, you spoke about history, and let's end there. Turning to a clip from the 1976 film Voyage of the Damned, the film based on the true story of the 1939 voyage of the MS Mississippi, which sailed for Havana from Hamburg, Germany, carrying over 900 Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis. The Cuban government refused entry to the passengers, so the ship made its way to the U.S., where the Coast Guard delivered the following message as portrayed in this clip from the film.
Attention, Captain St. Louis. You are violating U.S. territorial limits. Do not approach any closer. Do not attempt to land. You will not, repeat not, be permitted to dock at any United States port. Acknowledge.
Signal. Message received and acknowledged.
A clip from the 1976 film Voyage of the Damned. The ship was left with no choice but to return to Europe. And talk about what happened, Sarah.
Right, so these people had come here fleeing Nazi Germany, and in fact, they were turned back, and I believe it was upwards of 250 of those individuals who were turned back were ultimately found to have been killed in the Holocaust. I didn't know until researching this story that others, such as Anne Frank, her father had actually applied to get the family refugee status here, and they had also been rejected. And of course, she later died in the concentration camps as well.
So you and your students are continuing to search for what happens to deportees?
Absolutely. So we hope to continue searching in the Trump era and finding, again, I mentioned the Obama era had many of these deaths as well, so we should acknowledge that. But I think we hope to continue this process of logging these deaths in the Trump administration.
Sarah Stillman, staff writer at The New Yorker, also the director of the Global Migration Project at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. We'll link to her new piece. It's headlined, "When Deportation is a Death Sentence." This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.